Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today we're going to talk all about Phalaenopsis orchids. Specifically, some signs that tell you your Phalaenopsis might actually be quite stressed and you need to take a look at it and see what's wrong with your orchid. Sadly, recently I did have quite a few stressed Phalaenopsis due to the heat wave, but also due to previous thrips problems that left quite a few marks. However, I do want to transform this into a good situation and show you guys some signs that you should look out for, what they mean, why the orchids behave this way, so that in the future, if you ever see these signs, you know how to go about it. Today's video, together with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by rePotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from potting mixes to fertilizers, pots, and all sorts of other accessories. If you're into bonsais, African violets, and succulents, they do have something for you as well, so I'll be sure to link you to their website down below in the description, together with some of my personal favorite products that I have tried and I liked, or I'm still using with my orchids. So don't forget to check the description for additional information and also more tutorials dedicated to beginners. Alrighty, so before we start, I do want to mention that all of these things that I'm going to show you today, they are actually symptoms. I can tell you why they appear and what it means, but finding the cause will have to be something you guys need to do because you're the person who best knows your orchid. I don't know your orchid as good as you, and I definitely don't know the history. So when you're assessing the health of your orchid, do take into account the history of your orchid, how you've cared for it lately, or if it's a new orchid, where does it come from, and things of the sorts. Because sometimes the answer actually relies in the history or in the environment around the orchid, not necessarily in what you see on the leaves. But I hope that today I will at least put you on the right path to finding the answer yourself. So with that said, let's start. First, and one of the most common stress signs on your Phalaenopsis will be very soft and wrinkly leaves. When you see something like this on your Phalaenopsis, you know it is dehydration. Lack of water in the leaves makes them look really soft, limpy. They have ridges, whereas healthy Phalaenopsis leaves should not have any type of wrinkling. Now here's the more difficult part with dehydration. It doesn't only have one cause. It doesn't necessarily mean that you did not water your orchid enough, although that could be a reason, so absolutely consider it. But it can also mean that your orchid simply does not have a good root system or doesn't have roots at all, so it cannot actually absorb the water that you're providing. So if you've established that you are watering your orchid as frequent enough as to keep it hydrated, hypothetically, then take a look at the root system. Most probably, that's where the problem is. Now, dead roots can happen again for various reasons. And there are many instances in which your orchid will find herself without roots. For example, new orchids, particularly the flower shop ones, they do sometimes have quite big root issues because they're not really treated properly in the flower shops, or due to the transport situation, which might not have been ideal, they might have already lost the roots, and when you purchase it, or shortly after, you'll start to see the signs of dehydration that were not necessarily caused by you. Also, repotting an orchid from a potting mix to a very different potting mix can actually shock the roots, resulting in the older roots just dying off. Bottom line, this is a dehydration sign. But what exactly caused it, you will have to find out, and definitely check those roots, because if you don't have roots on your orchid, no matter how much water you offer, it will just not fix the problem since the orchid cannot actually absorb it. Next sign, excessive yellowing and drying of the bottommost leaves. Now, naturally, Phalaenopsis orchids will regenerate their leaf system, so periodically they will lose 1 or 2, maybe 3 leaves from the bottom, depending how tall the orchid is. Older Phalaenopsis with a lot of leaves can actually lose 2 or 3 very old leaves from the bottom, and it would not necessarily mean anything. However, when your entire orchid only has, let's say, 6 leaves and you lose 3, that is a problem. That is definitely a sign of stress. Now, this stress can actually be due to watering, dehydration, all of the things we talked about previously, but also it can have something to do with nutrients. What the orchid is doing is giving up the older structures in order to fortify the newer structures. So something like this definitely signifies some sort of stress that you need to address. If you don't have dehydration signs, then maybe look at the fertilizer schedule you are providing to your orchid, or the type of fertilizer you are providing, and if you are offering enough nutrients for your orchid. And again, when it comes to dehydration, try to find the cause. Is it that you are using an inadequate medium that suffocated the roots? Or did you recently repot your orchid and switched it to a medium which maybe it's not the best of quality? Or maybe it's just not suited for you? Or is it just the fact that life got a little bit too busy and you just didn't have enough time to water your orchid, coupled with a heat wave, which is my case? But these are real life situations and it can happen. Definitely though, this is a sign your Phalaenopsis is sending you to take some action as soon as you can. Next up, fresh new leaves which don't seem to open properly. And this is something that I get comments about quite often. A Phalaenopsis is growing a new leaf, but it doesn't seem to open, it stays folded. Well, this is very, very, very common. And although it is a sign of a little bit of stress, it is certainly not to the extent of what I just showed you previously. Again, it has to do with a hydration issue. Maybe you just didn't water in time, maybe you delayed watering a few days, and the orchid, as it was growing a new structure, simply did not have enough water in its system to just pump enough water in the leaf and open it up. There needs to be a little bit of pressure within the leaf to open it up and make it unfold as it should. What I'm showing you are two orchids which are suffering from dehydration. This is a little bit extreme. They are new orchids that have recently been repotted, so they're going through a little bit of an adjustment period, but you can actually have something similar on completely hydrated orchids. It takes a little bit for the orchid to actually show you the signs of dehydration. When a Phalaenopsis shows you signs, it's already pretty advanced. So you can have a perfectly looking Phalaenopsis which is growing a folded leaf. That only means that it needed just a little bit more water. This also can happen when the orchid doesn't have enough roots. So it has roots to keep it hydrated and perform normally, but it doesn't have enough to put on new structures as well. So it's quite a delicate, let's say, situation. Definitely don't freak out if you see a folded leaf. Usually after a good watering, after a few days or so, it will open up. Everything will be okay. It's not going to stay stuck forever unless the orchid continues to dehydrate. But since I had a lot of comments asking me about it, this is mainly why it's caused. So again, assess your orchid, and if the orchid is absolutely fine, don't worry about it. Probably you just delayed watering with a few days, and the problem will fix itself once your watering schedule goes back to normal as well. Next up, terminal spikes. Now, this is a bit of a wild card because it doesn't only happen under stress conditions. Some hybrids, particularly the ones in the flower shops, are prone to having terminal spikes, but sometimes it can actually happen due to stressful conditions. So first of all, what is a terminal spike? It is a flower spike that emerged from the crown of the orchid rather than from under one of the leaves, on the side of the orchid practically, like it's normal. As I was saying, some orchids grow these as a result of just quote-unquote bad genetics. It's how the gene pool kind of got mixed up when we hybridized orchids. And there is one which is very prone to having terminal spikes. It is a very tiny flowered, white-flowered miniature Phalaenopsis. I think it's called White Cloud. In flower shops, you'll definitely see it a lot. Check for terminal spikes on that orchid, but as I was saying, it can happen under stress conditions as well. In my case, I had a serious infestation with thrips last year, and the thrips preferred the crowns of my Phalaenopsis orchids where the new leaves were started. So many of my Phalaenopsis have pretty damaged crowns. This one was so damaged that it decided, hey, why not create a flower spike from the crown if leaves are not possible anymore? It will not always happen, but there we go. It is the case in which it can happen. In other cases, I had normal flower spikes sprout from under the leaves, but not being able to push through the leaf wall, as it were. So they made their way up all the way through the crown, pretty much damaging the crown because that was the softest spot they could actually come out from. And this can be related again to hydration, but also to nutrients. Some articles which talk about plants in general suggest that very high nitrogen fertilizers usually create pretty long but brittle stems. So maybe it has to do with the type of fertilizer being used. High nitrogen fertilizers are good, but it doesn't mean you should only use nitrogen fertilizers. The other elements are very important as well, and they do contribute to cellular wall formation amongst other things. So fertilizer can also be an issue, hence why it is always good to go for either a balanced fertilizer, either one that doesn't lack any of the micro elements. It has a little bit of everything at least. In this case, most probably the orchid will not create any more leaves from the crown since the growth point is compromised. It will do something else, which we will talk about in this video, practically create keikis. But as we can see, the formation of a terminal spike either has to do with genetics, which is quite common in some hybrids, either with a stress factor, which can be pretty much anything. My orchid is full of roots. As you can see, it is not a dehydration sign, but definitely it is a sign that the crown has been damaged, in my case, by an insect. Next sign, excessively producing keikis, specifically basal keikis. I do want to point out that if your orchid creates a basal keiki, there's really no reason to worry about. If the orchid looks fine, if it's healthy, if it has a good root system, if you're treating it properly, the better the care you provide, actually, the more likely you are to have healthy basal keikis on your orchid. But it can also happen if an orchid is severely stressed or it has suffered an event which incapacitates the crown, as it were. So either crown rot, either a terminal spike. These things can actually determine the creation of generally basal keikis, but not only flower spike keikis as well. If there is no flower spike on the orchid, then it will try to create a basal keiki. As you can see in this example, I do have a tiny baby orchid right here at the base, and it is very clear that in this case it happened because the crown was damaged. The orchid is just not capable of growing anymore. But when I say excessive keikis, I usually mean 2, 3, 4 even, especially when the orchid does not look happy and healthy at all. So in this other example, this is a pretty clear stress keiki production. The orchid is actually pretty new. It didn't actually come with a good root system. And what it decided to do was to try and create a new leaf, which as you can see is not open properly. It also decided to create roots, a basal keiki, and also a flower spike keiki as well. If this doesn't scream desperation, I don't know what does. This orchid is desperate. Obviously, orchids don't know that we're here for them and we're doing our best to care for them. They are going into survival mode at this point and they're trying to reproduce or make sure that they live on with whatever means they have at their disposal. And some orchids will react in this way. They will start to produce excessive amounts of keikis, sometimes not growing any other structure except for the keikis, other times growing leaves and roots at the same time. Now, in this instance, you'll have to make a judgment call. Sometimes the keikis produced will be excessive and they will just drain the orchid. If you think the mother orchid has chances of recuperating, it is starting to produce roots and leaves, then maybe consider removing at least some of the keikis, if not all of the keikis. Maybe even remove the flower spike so that you don't allow the orchid to try and produce another keiki on the flower spike. However, if you feel like the mother plant doesn't have enough energy to produce roots or is just unwilling to grow anymore, it is more willing to put energy into the keiki and the keiki grows much faster than anything on the orchid, then maybe consider saving the keiki and not the orchid. And I do actually have an example for you. Here's my beautiful Phalaenopsis schilleriana. This is not the original plant, it is a keiki. The mother plant had a problem that I personally cannot explain. It started to just melt, the leaves were melting from the tip all the way to the crown. The stem was perfectly fine, but it was putting much more energy into this keiki. The keiki was producing leaves and roots and the mother plant was slowly and surely just melting away, giving all of its energy to the keiki. Why? I don't know. It did not have crown rot, it did not have stem rot, nothing obvious. It is just something that I personally could not explain, but sometimes it can happen with orchids. So if you have an instance in which the mother plant slowly withers off, but the keiki is thriving, definitely remove the keiki, save the keiki, and in this way you will have another plant. It's just going to be a little bit sit back. I do actually have a video in which I separate this keiki. I will be sure to link you to it down below if you want to watch the story. In that video, the little keiki is this plant, and look at her after a few years, perfectly healthy brand new plant. These things happen. We're dealing with life things. We can't control them all the time. All we can do is just do our best and recognize what instance it is that we're dealing with. Next sign, buds falling before they even get to bloom. Now, we do have a separate video about bud blast and all of the causes which can actually make buds blast. They might have nothing to do with the health of the orchid. I'll link you to it down below. But in some instances, it has everything to do with the health and with the amount of stress the orchid is going through. So again, I'm gonna take this case of a very, very stressed and desperate, might I add, orchid, which, don't worry, I'm taking care of you. She just doesn't know that yet, but she's gonna be okay. So in this case, you can see that the orchid did have quite a few buds that were trying to open and they didn't. And it's pretty obvious why. The orchid is trying to put its energy into leaves, roots, keikis, buds, flowers. Even the keikis tried to produce buds and absolutely failed at it. There is simply not enough energy for the buds to open. Again, in this instance, the stress can be anything, not only dehydration or just the stress of trying to create a lot of keikis. This can also happen due to external conditions as well. I've had it happen a lot with Phalaenopsis in very, very low temperatures. At some point, it got very, very cold in my balcony back in the day, and what happened was most of the buds on my Phalaenopsis just yellowed and fell one night. It can also happen due to extremely high temperatures. They can actually be related to the state of the orchid. So again, check it out, see what's wrong. In this instance, there are many, many things wrong. And what I will do is actually remove completely this flower spike just to eliminate this keiki and the potential for any other buds, because the orchid is busy right now. It should definitely put its energy into itself. This bottom keiki, I will let it be. I feel like the amount of roots are enough for everything, but this keiki right here has no business existing. So because this orchid is a hybrid, actually, it's not a species, and it has been produced in cultivation, its instincts, quote unquote, are not what they should be, like the proper orchids in nature. So I will have to intervene here and just guide it in the right direction, because it is just not a very fit orchid at this point. But it's okay, we still love them, don't we? Next up, very tiny new leaves. And I think this example that I'm showing you is pretty dramatic. Look at the leaves the orchid had in the past and look at the new ones. There is no comparison. They are a third of what they should be. But the good news is they're getting better and better. Now, tinier leaves simply mean not enough energy. And of course, this can be caused by dehydration, but also by lack of nutrients, lack of roots, all of those fun stuff that are related to not enough energy. And in my instance, this was a new orchid which did not have roots. And in the meantime, it does have quite a few roots, it grew roots, so the leaves are starting to get better and better. But because you can see this orchid did not have many leaves to begin with, it only had 2 leaves to photosynthesize and produce the food for all of these other structures. Even though smaller leaves do mean stress, how small they will be and how long before normal leaves start to grow will only be determined by what is the state of your orchid right now. If you don't have a lot of structures to begin with, you will probably have tinier growths for quite a while. But if you have quite a few structures, you probably won't have as many tiny growths until normality settles in once again. But definitely smaller leaves on Phalaenopsis mean quite a bit of stress, and sometimes it can lead to something that looks like this, which is not very appealing, but in time it will correct itself. These leaves will never grow large again, they will remain like this, but the new leaves will progressively grow bigger and bigger. So that is about it for today, and before I let you go, I will remind you that the lack of blooms doesn't necessarily mean your orchid is not happy and it's not doing well. Keep in mind, flower shop Phalaenopsis are seasonal bloomers. Even though they can rebloom off of the same flower spike for a year even, at some point they will stop blooming and they will devote time to growing leaves and roots. What I'm showing you here are summer bloomer Phalaenopsis. They're very different than flower shop Phalaenopsis. So if you're into Phalaenopsis, but you would like to have something in between flowerings of your flower shop Phalaenopsis, why not consider the summer bloomers? You can find them in orchid nurseries and they're a joy to grow. Look how beautiful they are. They even look a little bit different and their flowers are very fragrant. I personally recommend the Bellina. She is the queen of fragrant Phalaenopsis. And as an ending note, don't worry if your orchid is currently stressed. Everybody has some stressed orchids due to various reasons. Some of them even induced by us. We're not perfect, and we also don't live perfect lives that we can devote to our orchids. So all you have to do is observe your orchid, see the signs, and try to find the cause, because soon enough, before you know it, your orchid will stop looking sad and unhappy and will start to grow luscious green new leaves. Alrighty guys, so thank you so much for watching. Hope you found this useful and interesting. Thank you rePotme for sponsoring yet another video in this entire Orchid Care for Beginners series. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I hope you have a great day and I'll see you next time. Bye!